With the April 8th eclipse only a few weeks away, we are thrilled to welcome meteorologist Joe Rao with us tonight to talk about the 13 eclipses he has traveled the globe to witness. Welcome, Joe.
All right. Thank you very much, Liz. Thank you very much, everybody. And yes, I have journeyed literally around the world to see 13 eclipses, but I'm not going to talk about all 13. I might take up most of the night, but I'm going to talk about some of the funny, some of the poignant things that have happened on my chase around the globe to see these amazing events. And I hope now all of you can see that. And as Liz mentioned, this is a program that is sponsored by not one but three libraries: the Lewisboro Library, the library in Pelham, and also the Harrison Public Library. And the name of the talk, as has already been mentioned, is Adventures of Eclipse Chaser, and I am the Eclipse Chaser, Joe Rao. Okay, so yes, we do have an eclipse of the sun coming up on April the 8th. What an incredible sight that will be for those of you who are privileged to see it from the zone of totality. Who among us would not marvel at the spectacle of a total eclipse? No spectacle that nature has to offer can rival a total eclipse of the sun for sheer drama and excitement. It's not just something that's seen, it's something that, well, those of you who have been privileged to see a total eclipse realize it's an experience. Every fiber of you becomes involved during those precious moments of totality. And of course, at the beginning and the end, we have those magnificently beautiful diamond ring effects which grace our skies. They are indelibly implanted into our memories, and they remain a lifetime once we have been there where the shadow of the moon strikes the earth. Anyway, we're going to start this off by, well, a couple of items. As I said, seen eclipses from virtually everywhere. The last time I went to a total eclipse was in December of 2021, and I did it with my lovely wife. You see there on the left. Her name is Renata, and the two of us journeyed all the way, I guess, as far away as you could possibly get, down to Antarctica, believe it or not. And in fact, you can see just off of my shoulder there a sea lion basking in the relatively warm sunshine. It was, you got to remember that December, they're moving into summertime in the southern hemisphere. And on this particular day in Antarctica, the temperature was around 30 degrees. That was pretty warm for sea lions and for penguins alike. Also, a view of a beautiful total eclipse that I saw in August of 1999 from off the coast of Nova Scotia. This particular eclipse was quite spectacular, and it occurred right after sunrise. And you can see that, again, beautiful diamond ring effect that led into a full 50 seconds of darkness, 50 seconds of total eclipse. Now, this gentleman, who lived way back in the 19th century, is Professor Charles A. Young. And on August 7th, 1869, in Burlington, Iowa, with his special prism spectroscope, Professor Young was hoping to discover what the corona, that crown of light that appears around the darkened sun during totality, what the corona was composed of. He had an assistant, his name was William Harkness, and it was Harkness who was handing Professor Young a lantern, because again, during the total phase of the eclipse, when the sun is covered, it can get quite dark. So Harkness was handing Professor Young a lantern to read the micrometer head moments after totality set in. And then, as Harkness looked up to the sky and saw the sun, the darkened sun in the sky, he suddenly exclaimed, "Oh my God, look at that!" And this is what Professor Young wrote later in his journal. "I looked over my shoulder for just an instant and beheld the most beautiful and impressive spectacle upon which my eyes ever rested. It couldn't have been more than 5 seconds, but the effect was so overwhelming as to drive away all certain recollections of what I had just seen." So here's this man trying to study his spectroscope, trying to mentally, see exactly what was happening during that short period of totality. And now, as he said, the view of the eclipsed sun in the sky drove away all recollections which he had just seen. He said, he continued, I cannot describe the sensation of surprise and mortification and personal imbecility and wasted opportunity that overwhelmed me when the sunlight flashed out. So I could only assume that Professor Young became so emotionally overwrought that it might have just produced sort of a paralysis. I can visualize this old man just staring, absolutely transfixed, and down the drain probably went many days, many weeks of preparations and dry runs in advance of the eclipse. And this is not the first person that this has happened to, and this affects a lot of people. This young man, for example, who's speaking to you right now, although this photograph was taken about 60 years ago. Look at that big clunker that's behind me as I'm proudly getting ready to mount my bike. I was just about 7 years old when I got a chance to see my first eclipse. And the eclipse was not a total, but it was a partial eclipse. And it was my grandfather who told me on a summer July morning in 1963 that later that day there was going to be an eclipse of the sun. And I, of course, at 7 years old, I said, well, what's an eclipse, Grandpa? And that's when I got my first lesson in celestial mechanics. He took the salt and pepper shaker off the kitchen shelf, put them on the kitchen table, made a fist and said, pretend my fist is the sun, the salt shaker is the moon, the pepper shaker is the earth. Later today, the salt shaker, or in this case, the moon, is going to pass in front of the sun, partially blocking it from view, and that is what we call an eclipse. And I must tell you that the eclipse was rather big news that day. People all around across the United States preparing to look at it and making special eclipse projectors with boxes, corrugated cardboard boxes, or if they had telescopes, they used telescopes. Some people used exposed pieces of film to look directly up at the sun and to get a view of the moon as it passed in front of the sun. The only one who was supposedly not interested, I guess, was the German Shepherd, but everybody else looking skyward, waiting and watching for the moon to make its move on the sun. Now, I must tell you that watching this from my grandparents' house in Throgs Neck in the Bronx, unfortunately, that particular day where I was rather cloudy. In fact, it was cloudy across much of New York for much of the time that the eclipse was going on. But fortunately, as the eclipse was reaching its peak, where the sun would be about 90% covered, the clouds thinned and broke. And there you see what I remember all of those years ago, a crescent sun in the sky, filtered again by the clouds. Oh, it was an interesting, and it was indeed a very beautiful, spectacular sight. As the newspapers the next day reported, New Yorkers see a spectacular view as those clouds began to part in our sky. It was only a partial eclipse, but it was still very interesting. And after the eclipse was over and we went inside to have dinner, as my grandmother would call me, a little chatterbox, I kept saying, boy, that was really something. That was incredible. You see that in the sky, Grandpa, and everything else? And my grandfather, sitting there listening to all of this, said, I made a big mistake today. Instead of staying in the Bronx, I should have taken you up to Maine, because in Maine, that was where the eclipse was going to be complete. That's where it was going to be total. That band that you see, that dark band that stretches across the central part of Maine, inside of that band, roughly 55 miles wide, a total eclipse of the sun was visible, and it was visible for approximately 1 minute. And so that would have been a great place to see a total eclipse. And my grandfather spoke with experience, because when he was 16 years old, living in New York, he was witness to a total eclipse of the sun. On that day, January 24th, 1925, this was the day after, in the New York Times, you see what a big deal it was. The eclipse was a little late in getting there, but it was a brilliant show, seen from land, sea, and air. My grandfather later said that in all the years since, he never saw a more spectacular, more beautiful sight. And he said after our partial eclipse in 1963, if we get another chance to see a total, I'm going to take you to see it. And this was the view from Bronx Park, He saw it from the FDR Drive. Actually, then it was the East River Drive, later to become the FDR Drive in Upper Manhattan. And it was a beautiful, beautiful sight. He said, "Oh, boy, I wish I could see another one." And that's why he said to me, when there's another chance to see one, we're going to go. We're going to see one. Well, in 1970, there was an eclipse close to New York, but we didn't see that one because, unfortunately, my grandfather was in the hospital at the time having an operation. However, 2 years later, in July of 1972, there would be a total eclipse of the sun visible over the Gaspé Peninsula of Quebec. And so he said, "We're going to go." And he loaded all of us, my grandmother, my mother, my sister, and I. We all got into his beat up Plymouth Fury and took a leisurely 900-mile drive up to the Gaspé to see a total eclipse of the sun. Here you see Montreal. We stopped there one night. Then the next night we stopped in Quebec City. And then we worked our way on a 5-hour trip up along the Gaspé Peninsula to a little town called Cap Chat, Quebec. And they were right in the middle. As you see, here's the path of the total eclipse in July of 1972, July the 10th. And right on the center line of the eclipse was Cap Chat, and that's where we were that afternoon. Here you see my grandmother and grandfather looking through a exposed piece of film at the sun. And this montage of the developing eclipse was not taken by me. It was taken by who was going to become a very close and lifelong friend, really, of mine, a gentleman by the name of Glenn Schneider. And Glenn was in Cap Chat too, but he was about 500 or 600 yards away from where myself and my family were when the eclipse was taking place. And notice, if you will, that there are clouds that are slowly creeping in on the sun during the eclipse. And in fact, this picture in the lower right-hand corner of an exceedingly thin crescent sun was the last that Glenn saw from his location in Cap Chat of that eclipse, because unfortunately, right after he took that picture, a cloud rolled in over the sun and he missed the total phase of the eclipse. I, on the other hand, again, maybe several hundred yards away, got caught in the same cloud cover, but for me, from my vantage point, the cloud, after 30 seconds of totality, moved on or moved off enough so that I had a view of the total eclipse from where I was. Glenn was skunked, but I wasn't, and I got a chance to see the beautiful corona surrounding the darkened sun. And it was a spectacle, just like my grandfather said, that, he told me in advance, he said, "You're never going to forget this when you see it." And I didn't. And in fact, I became even more hooked on eclipses, which is why all these years later, I ended up seeing not just one or two, but 13. And those eclipses are what I have logged. And hopefully in a few weeks, I'll be able to say that I've seen 14 eclipses. And I hope that all of you, after this talk, make plans to try to see that yourself, that total eclipse of the sun. Here you see one happy guy. And interestingly, 16 years old at the time in 1972, same age as my grandfather when he saw his eclipse from New York in 1925. Now, as far as Glenn is concerned, the guy who got skunked, he and I, as I said, became good friends. 6 months later, in January of 1973, I volunteered or went to the Hall of Science in Flushing, where they had a planetarium, and volunteered to work there during the weekends. And so did Glenn. Glenn, too, decided that he was going to be a volunteer at the Hall of Science, and that's how we met, and that's how we got to know each other. Interestingly, we were both Bronx boys. We lived within several miles of each other, although we never knew it at the time until we met at the Hall of Science. Second, we were enthusiastic amateur astronomers with a special affinity for the phenomenon of eclipses. In fact, both of us were turned on to eclipses by our grandfathers. They were both immigrants to this great country. My Italian grandfather was Mario. Glenn's Jewish grandfather was Max. And Mario and Max were witnesses to that 1925 eclipse in New York, and later on conveyed its beauty and grandeur to their grandsons. And interestingly, Mario and Max were born on the very same day, Thursday, December 17th, 1908. I sometimes ask Glenn, "Are you sure we're not related? Or if not, maybe we're joined at the hip, so to speak." It seemed that way. In 1977, Glenn called me on the phone and said, "How would you like to try to see the eclipse of the sun that's going to occur later this year in October?" Well, I knew where that eclipse was going to be. It wasn't going to be in the United States, it was going to be in another country, South America, Colombia, South America. And I said, "How are we going to see that?" He said, "We're going to run a tour, you and I. We will advertise in some of the astronomy magazines and tell people that we'll take them down to South America and we will all have a chance to see a total eclipse of the sun," which was to occur to the north of the capital city of Colombia, Bogota. And these two lines indicating the path of the total eclipse, we would go north of Bogota into the wild and woolly countryside to the north of that cosmopolitan city into Cundinamarca and see that total solar eclipse. So here we are, two tykes, tiny tykes. We were both only 21 years old. And in fact, on the day of the eclipse, October 12th, 1977, which also is a national holiday in Colombia, Columbus Day, Glenn would turn, 22 years of age. And so here we are. And I often wonder what the people who signed on to our tour, we actually convinced about 20 people to come along. Most of the demographic, the age of those people who signed on were mostly in their 40s and 50s. In fact, we even had a couple of people who were close to 80 years old. And here are these two kids are going to be our tour leaders for this event in this strange, exotic country of Colombia. Here is the bus that we managed to end up chartering for our event. And this gentleman you see in the front of the bus, his name is Tomas. Oh, Tomas. I still remember him all of these years later, what he did to Glenn and myself on this trip. The bus was not very reliable. You know, one thing, if you're going to have a tour, make sure that all of your equipment works. Unfortunately for us, literally right after we got started and headed for the eclipse area or eclipse zone, the bus broke down, and it broke down more than a few times. But we were able to progress out of Bogota up to the north, and we passed several communities, and everybody in these various towns and villages very excited about the impending eclipse. Here I'm showing one of the locals how to use a piece of exposed photographic film to look at the sun during the partial phases of the eclipse. And here is a bunch of people in front of our bus as we're all looking skyward. And it was right about this time when we were passing through one of the villages, I think it was the town of Subachoque, that Tomas, here he is again, I'm pointing to him now with my cursor, came up to Glenn and me and said, "Senors, I know a special way as a shortcut to where you want to go. Would you like to go there?" And, Glenn and I, we looked at each other and figured this gentleman knew what he was talking about. He said, "Yeah, sure. Take the shortcut." The way that we were planning to go would be on a narrow road, but at least the road was in good condition. At least we were able to figure that out from maps. But this shortcut, according to Tomas, well, he had not been on this shortcut for about 7 years. And what we quickly found out was that the shortcut was a dirt road, a rutty road filled with stones and rocks and potholes. And it was along the way on this rutty road that we ran into a tropical shower. Now, I know you probably have experienced a heavy downpour in your time, but you've not seen rain come down until you've experienced it in the tropics, where you have a tropical downpour. And of course, the worst place you could possibly be when a tropical downpour hits is on a dirt road, which very quickly turned to mud, and very quickly the bus got stuck in the mud. And we had to get our paying passengers who paid them good money for this tour all to get out and push the bus out of the mud. Then Tomas had to gingerly try to turn the bus around. Since we couldn't go forward on that muddy road, we had to go back to one of the towns that we had passed through earlier. That town was El Rosal. Fortunately, one of the merchants, upon seeing us all dirt and mud filled, was kind enough to allow us to wash up in the back of his store. But now, after all of this happened, the time for the eclipse was almost here. So what were we going to do? So we quickly headed back on the original road that we were supposed to go on, a paved road, I might add. We weren't able to get up to the center of the eclipse, but we were able to get up close enough so that we would see 38 seconds, 38 seconds of total eclipse. But of course, this all came in the aftermath of that tropical shower, that tropical downpour. And as you would expect, the skies were not the clearest. In fact, there, one of our tour participants, a young man from Massachusetts by the name of Alden Wells, is pointing to the one patch of blue sky we had as the eclipse got underway. That was it. But in the minutes that followed, that blue patch got bigger and wider, and eventually, within about 15 or 20 minutes, the sky, believe it or not, became mainly clear, just some scattered clouds lingering. Here was Glenn with his telescope set up, projecting the image of the sun onto a white piece of cardboard, and I guess he was pointing to a sunspot. 5 minutes before totality, and the sky was again reasonably clear, and Glenn said to me, "No, it's in the bag. We're going to see it. We're going to see totality." Not really. One small cloud, like the Goodyear blimp, came seemingly out of nowhere, drifted across in front of the sun, and during the dark total phase of the eclipse, this is what we saw. We saw a dark cloud, and on the edges of the clouds, we saw chromospheric pink. This is the color of the sun's outer atmosphere, which is visible at the beginning and end of totality, and that light causing the cloud or the edge of the cloud to appear kind of a pinkish red coloration. But the sun somewhere behind here, and we did not see the total phase of 38 seconds because the cloud cover unfortunately blocked our view. And right after the eclipse finished totality, what did you think the cloud did? It moved away, the sun was back out bright and shiny again, and we saw something we didn't think we'd see, an unusual sunset. The sun set it while it was still in partial eclipse beyond a distant radio tower. Well, that would have been that would have been the icing on the cake had we seen the total phase of the eclipse, but we didn't because, again, of that one lone cloud. Well, it was a bummer going back to our hotel in Bogota, and after the trip and tour were finished, we went back to New York. It took a couple of weeks, and then Glenn called me up and said, "We can't let this happen. We can't leave this on our record. We have to move forward." And I said, "So what are we going to do?" And he says, "We're going to have another tour at the next total eclipse, and we'll call it Blackout 79. This particular total eclipse in 1979 occurred in the month of February and would start over the Pacific Ocean. You see the path of totality, and then would roll across the Pacific Northwest and then on up into Canada. Glenn said, "We're not going to get skunked by the weather, hopefully, this time around. But since you're a meteorologist," and I had just graduated from college with a degree in atmospheric science, he said, "So what you're going to do is you're going to check all the weather records and figure out where would be the best spot with the best weather prospects for the eclipse." I checked and I looked, and I decided that the best view would be afforded if we went to this little town right here, Lewistown, Montana, which is not too far away from the larger city of Great Falls, Montana. And you can see here's the eclipse track taking it across Montana and on up into North Dakota. There's Minot, North Dakota in the totality path, and then crossing over into Manitoba in Canada and also encompassing the city of Winnipeg, Manitoba. But I chose Lewistown. I said this seems to be the best site with the best weather prospects. And a year before we were to go to Lewistown for the eclipse, and P.S., we did put together another tour, and this time we had not 20, but 80 people involved, 2 busloads of people who are going to be involved with this expedition or tour to see the total eclipse of February 26, 1979. And a year in advance, we alerted Lewistown. We wrote to the newspaper there, the Lewistown News Argus, and in the news release that we had put together, we said, "We're declaring Lewistown, Montana, the eclipse capital of the world." And upon hearing this and putting it, it got on the front page of the newspaper. The town, Lewistown, greeted us with open arms and got very, very excited about the fact that their city, their town, was located right smack in the middle of the total eclipse path of 1979. And here you see myself and another meteorologist. His name is Keith Eichner. Keith, at the time, was doing the weather on a television station in Minneapolis. And over here, this gentleman sitting down and looking at these screens, these monitors, was William Rammer, the MIC, the meteorologist in charge at the National Weather Service in Great Falls, who provided us with updated weather information on the eclipse. The night before the eclipse, we were staying at a place called the Yogo Inn. I gave a presentation giving the latest weather forecasts and latest weather information and telling everybody about what our chances would be to see the eclipse. It looked like we'd be able to watch it from someplace in Lewistown, a big field called the Quality Seed Factory. That's where we were going to set up all of our equipment. But then, some hours later, a new weather forecast came in which suggested that we'd actually have clouds advancing toward us from the west. And here I am showing Glenn and also his girlfriend at the time, Susan, the latest data. And I suggested to Glenn, it might be good to leave quickly on the two buses and not see it from Lewistown, but maybe travel to the east to outrace the clouds advancing in from the west so that we'd get a clear view of the eclipse. And that's exactly what we did. The next day, two buses, and as you can see, a little bit better condition than the buses that we had, or the bus that we had in Columbia. So we loaded these 80 people on two buses and immediately started out to the east, and I believe on Route 200 in Montana, to try to find a place where we could set up all of our equipment for the eclipse, which was now very quickly advancing toward us. It was going to be an eclipse that would start at 8 o'clock in the morning. This picture was taken around 6:30 a.m. as we were getting ready to load all the people on the bus. We rode for about an hour, and eventually we came across this, a large barn and a farmhouse and a big, big field. And we said to ourselves, this looks like a perfect place to look and observe the eclipse from, but could we do it? Could we get permission? So Glenn and I got out of the bus. Each one of us was in each bus. So I got out of one bus, he got out of the other. We hiked up to the farmhouse, knocked on the door, and this gentleman opens the door. His name was Artie, by the way, and he's looking wide-eyed at us, but also at the two busloads of people. And it was Glenn who said, "Excuse me, sir, but we are here from New York, and we have come to see the total eclipse. We're looking for a place to set up our equipment. We'd like to know if we could set up in your field." And Artie said, You came all the way from New York to see the eclipse?" He said, "Well," he said, "welcome. Go on. All of you folks, you want to go on my field? Fine." He said, "Now it'd be a different story if it were July or August, but right now the only thing I have out there that's growing is sagebrush, grass, and snow. But come on out. Come on." So we gave the thumbs up. You never saw two busloads of people, 80 people come running out of a bus with all kinds of paraphernalia, telescopes, binoculars, cameras, all setting up on the big field to Artie's field to watch and prepare for the upcoming eclipse. Here you see me and several others, and we were using welder's goggles and welder's glass to look at the eclipse as it was progressing. Here you see me with a big smile on my face, wearing my down vest and jacket. Temperature about 35 or 34 degrees, wasn't overly cold. But what you're about to hear is some snippets, the audio of a tape recording that Keith had made of the sights and sounds of the eclipse. And also you will see some of the photographs that people snapped as we led into totality of the solar eclipse, with the approach, first of all, of the shadow of the moon. Here you see 2 minutes before totality, the giant lunar shadow approaching from the west. And what you're also going to hear, along with the people's reactions to the advance of the eclipse. What you're also going to hear in the background, you'll hear kind of a moderation of kind of like a doo doo doo. That was a shortwave station, a shortwave time signal station that provides. As I take a swig here, hang on for a second. A shortwave radio station that provides time signals so that we could accurately time out the eclipse. But that's what you'll hear, and you'll soon see the sights of Blackout 79, the total eclipse of February 1979.
It's getting spooky. It does look like a storm gathering now off to the west. It's a thin crescent, about 98% now. I got a microphone here if you want it. Here we are. 1% before totality now. 1 minute before totality or less. Got it? Okay. Unbelievable. Oh, this is unbelievable. Oh, my God. I don't believe this. This is unreal. Look at this Bailey speed. We got Bailey speed. Oh, yeah, we got it. Oh, that's beautiful. Look at the glow in the sky. You can see that the shadow is elliptical shape. I forgot to start. Well, don't worry about it. Shit, I forgot to start mine.
Oh, look at the prominences. Anybody with binoculars, look at the prominences. They're absolutely fantastic. Look at the red all around. Look at the red. Oh, my God, look at the silhouettes of the sky.
Oh, I got to see another one. This is unreal. They're kind of big.
4, 3, 2, 1. There it is. Shadow. There goes the shadow. All right. Three cheers for the eclipse.
As I said, if you have not seen a total eclipse, you have not seen anything. You must, before you die, see at least one total eclipse of the sun. Afterwards, a couple of guys put me on their shoulders because I was the guy who made the decision to move at the last minute to a clear spot. And we avenged, Glenn and myself, our disappointing experience in Colombia from 2 years ago, and with great success saw that total eclipse of 1979. There is one gentleman who was not on our tour. He saw the eclipse not from Montana, but from his homeland of Canada. That gentleman's name is Terence Dickinson, who was the astronomer of Canada. I guess you could say that he was the Neil deGrasse Tyson of Canada. He was not only well known from one end of Canada to the other, but he was very well regarded in his eclipse photographs, and he was going to take his very first photograph of a total eclipse. He had never seen one before in the 1979 event. I'm sorry to say that Terry passed away last year, but he does leave a legacy of great photographs and great writings and books about astronomy and space. But when he was going to attempt to photograph the eclipse of February 1979, this is what he wrote. He said, "I was totally unprepared for the awesome beauty and overwhelming power of a total eclipse. I was so overwhelmed, I was incapable of performing even the most rudimentary tasks. It soon immediately became apparent that I would never be able to photograph the event. It was commanding me to use every second of viewing time to let my eyes soak up the image. I wrenched my camera off the telescope and quickly slipped in an eyepiece into the focuser and gazed upon what was the most stunning and awesomely beautiful astronomical image that I have ever seen." And it's for this reason that I tell first-timers not to try to bother to photograph their first total eclipse. Rather, if you've never seen a total eclipse before, what you should do is just let it sweep over you, spend those precious moments drinking it all in with your eyes, with binoculars or a telescope. Glenn, in fact, told me that it his very first eclipse in 1970. He had a pair of binoculars hanging around his neck, but he was so dumbfounded, so overwhelmed by the sight, that during the 2.5 minutes of totality, he never used them. Can you believe that? Anyway, my next eclipse after 1979 wouldn't come until 11 years later, in July of 1990. And this is what Sky and Telescope magazine, in their July edition, wrote about that eclipse. Not exactly conducive for wanting to see it. It's going to be elusive. Over much of the eclipse path, there'll be low clouds, fog. The best bet would be to observe it from an aircraft. If you can find an aircraft to fly over Siberia or the Aleutian Islands. So pretty much up until about, I'd say, 2 weeks before this eclipse in July of 1990, I said, are you crazy? I'm not going to go and try to see that. But they also, in Sky and Telescope, had a map. And the map showed us something very interesting. If you lived in the western United States, you could catch the end of the eclipse as a partial eclipse. You can see here are the various phases. If you were in Anchorage or Seattle or San Francisco, the sun would be setting, about half covered. Billings, Montana, or Honolulu. You go to Honolulu, you'd see about 3/4 of the sun covered. But there would be no eclipse in the central and eastern states. So here in the New York metropolitan area, we would not see anything. I'm looking at this map, and I'm thinking, it's interesting. Here's San Francisco, I said to myself, and here's Honolulu, and here's the eclipse track, the total eclipse track, which at this point was passing across the Aleutian Islands and then coming to an end midway between Honolulu and San Francisco in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And I said to myself, I wonder if there might be some kind of a commercial airline that would be flying from either San Francisco to Honolulu or vice versa. Maybe they'd be out over the Pacific Ocean at about the same time the eclipse was reaching its peak, and it would give a chance for people on board the plane to see totality. Well, this is 1990. We didn't have Travelocity.com. We didn't have Expedia. We didn't have any of those sites. Most people, in fact, didn't even know anything about social media at that particular point in time. That was still several years in the future. But I did have a library. I was living in Levittown, Long Island, and I decided I'd take a trip to the library, and I asked if they had a book called OAG, the Official Airline Guide. It came out every month, and it was about the size of a Brooklyn or Bronx telephone classified section, Yellow Pages. This thick book would tell you how you can go from one part of the world to another by taking an aircraft. If, for example, I wanted to know how I could get from Omaha, Nebraska to Tokyo, Japan, this book will tell me. This book had all the flights, the complete schedule of all the flights going from point A to point B in this. And so I spent a couple of hours at the Levittown Library with the OAG, the Official Airline Guide, checking through, looking through, trying to find some flight that might be in the right position over the Pacific Ocean at the time to possibly encounter the total eclipse of the sun. And I found one. It doesn't exist anymore. It went out of business about 10 years ago. But the name of the airline was American Transair. And they had a flight 402, which flew from Honolulu to San Francisco. Now, when I called up the airline and I got somebody in the corporate division, they sounded very interested. And they said, wow, this is something special. Maybe we'll consider it. And I said, unfortunately, in order for this to work, you have to delay the flight. Delay the flight by how long? About 41 minutes. Well, maybe we can work that out. And believe it or not, they did. See what you can do when you call a corporate office or maybe write a letter? Sometimes things happen. And in this case, it happened. They actually said that they were going to do this. In order for me to be a part of this, and I also told a couple of eclipse chasing buddies of mine, and I also told my wife, who was 6 months pregnant, I might add, what we had to do is we flew from JFK Airport on a Friday night to San Francisco. We got there at about 12:30 in the morning, Saturday morning. We booked a hotel, rooms in a hotel at the airport, got up the next morning, got on board American Transair Flight 403, which took us from San Francisco to Hawaii. And we got off the plane in Hawaii for about 45 minutes while they cleaned the plane up, got back on the plane, and then flew back to San Francisco. And along the way, hopefully, we were going to encounter a total eclipse of the sun. Here you see my wife, Renata, on the left, my best friend and also the best man at my wedding, Sam Storch, who was also into astronomy. And here's Craig Small wearing the NASA cap. And Craig, so into eclipses, actually had a flag that made up showing the darkened sun, prominences, the corona. And this is his lucky charm. He has been now to over 30 eclipses, and every time he's taken this flag with him, he has been lucky enough to have clear weather and good weather for viewing the eclipse in question. So this was his lucky charm. He brought it along with him on our flight. And here we are at the airport getting ready to board flight 402. Now, it says on the message board here 3:20, but again, we were going to delay the flight by 41 minutes to 4:01. And they had me get on board that flight and go on the loudspeaker and tell everybody on board this plane, an L-1011 jet carrying over 300 people, why we were purposely delaying the flight by 41 minutes. At first, you hear the moans and groans like, oh, why are they delaying the flight? We want to get home, get back to San Francisco. But then I said, there's a good reason, because if we do it and if we hit it just right, we will have a chance to see a total eclipse of the sun. This was before 9/11, by the way. So I was allowed as a passenger to just arbitrarily walk into the cockpit, the flight deck, and interact with the pilots. This was our captain, Captain Bob Leary. And Captain Leary, great guy from Texas, he said, you can call me Bob, Captain Bob. And when I got into the cockpit after we took off from San Francisco, I knew that we were supposed to reach a specific spot over the Pacific Ocean to encounter the eclipse at 4:10 Greenwich Mean Time, 4 hours, 10 minutes GMT. So when I got into the cockpit after we took off and I looked at the all of the gauges that were on in front of the pilots, I saw one LED, lit up with 4:13. Obviously, it was a time or a clock. And I asked Captain Bob, I said, what is that, 4:13? And he said, oh, I was going to tell you about that. He said, a Continental Airlines flight got in front of us just before we were going to take off. And so that delayed us for a few minutes. He said, so we had to make some resettings of everything. He said, but that's going to be where we're going to get to that part of the Pacific Ocean. We're going to get there at 4:13, a few minutes late, but that's not going to be a big deal, is it? And when he told me this, my face must have blanched, and he immediately must have realized that something was wrong. Because you see, 4:10 was when the moon's shadow would be crossing that particular part of the Pacific Ocean, moving at about 5,000 miles per hour. If we got there at 4:13, the shadow would have already moved on. And when we got there at 4:13, we would see almost a total eclipse, but not quite. So I told Captain Bob, I said, Captain Bob, we got to be there at 4:10. We can't be there at 4:13. It'll be too late. So Captain Bob said, so what you're asking me is you want me to make up 3 minutes? I said, can you? Can you? He says, well, we're going to try. He said, we'll put pedal to the metal, so to speak. And so what he did was he actually went down in altitude to a little known airway. All of these aircraft, all of these planes and jets that you see in the sky, they're following along an airway, or literally like a highway in the sky. Captain Bob used an airway over the Pacific that was not used normally by most aircraft, but it would allow him to zoom, so to speak. And he did. He went from like 500 miles or 500 knots to maybe like 700 knots to make up those 3 minutes. Now, as I said, the eclipse was to occur, totality was going to occur over the Pacific at 4:10 Greenwich Mean Time. This is the beginning of a video taken by my friend Sam Storch. Notice what the clock says. The clock says 4:10:11. And, the realization is that, oh my goodness, we're not going to get there in time. We didn't get there in time. The sun was going to be like 99.9% covered, but we were going to miss totality, or so I thought. Now watch the video as we started here, as we move toward total eclipse.
There's Corona. There it is.
And so we made it. Thank goodness. We got 73 seconds of total eclipse. And if you're wondering about how people on a 300 people in an aircraft, some of them seemingly were more interested in just reading a magazine or watching the in-flight movie. Others who did want to see the eclipse but were not near a window seat simply stood 3 and 4 deep in the aisle on the plane, looking out a window straight out, and they were able to see the totally eclipsed sun. I took this photograph with my still camera of the diamond ring effect. Craig probably took the best picture of all. This is a view of the shadow of the moon at mid-totality. You can see the elliptical or oval shape of the shadow. The view here on the left, lower left and lower right, looking outside of the shadow of the moon, this reddish sunset or sunrise coloration. And there you see the corona, the beautiful corona, the crown of the sun, visible only during a total eclipse of the sun. After the plane had landed in San Francisco, we got the flight crew together with Captain Bob and the rest of the flight crew holding Craig's eclipse flag. And as I said, some people seemingly were more interested in the in-flight movie. The movie leading into the eclipse, and it came to an end before the eclipse, was Driving Miss Daisy. As Sam said to a reporter from the New York Times in the aftermath of all of this, I don't know where they were driving her, but I'm just glad she got there before the total phase of the eclipse. A year later, in July of 1991, we had what some were calling the big one, a total eclipse that was going to last about as long as any eclipse would in total eclipse until the year 2150, almost 7 minutes in duration. And that eclipse would be total and reach its peak over Mexico, where those 2 stars you see there happen to be. That was the zone of the greatest eclipse, where again the eclipse would last almost 7 minutes in total phase. But I wasn't there. I was way over here in Hawaii. The total eclipse would pass over the big island of Hawaii, and I was hired by American Hawaii Cruises to be the onboard meteorologist to help move a cruise ship into the right position to see the total eclipse of the sun. Here you see the advertisement for this eclipse cruise, and here you see right smack in the middle of the advertisement, Joe Rao, meteorologist, who will position the SS Independence for the greatest possibility of seeing the spectacle. Basically, it seemed to me to be a no-brainer that this was not going to be so difficult. Here you see myself and Renata, and next to us, wearing this rather garish-looking Hawaiian shirt, was the meteorologist in charge at the National Weather Service in Honolulu, Hans Rosendahl. And Hans would provide me with latest weather updates when I was on the ship. And it didn't seem to be difficult, because you see, in the month of July, the trade winds from the northeast blow. They interact with the tall volcanic cones on the big island of Hawaii. The air from the northeast is pushed upward as they run into the volcanic cones or mountains in such a way so that the east side of the big island usually is cloudy and rather rainy. But on the western side of the island, the air goes down slope from the mountains and volcanoes, and as a result, the air is compressed, dried out. We're in the rain shadow, if you will, on the western side of the island, and as a result, we not only are guaranteed rain-free conditions, but also are pretty much guaranteed cloud-filled conditions as well. And since the trade winds in July blow 95% of the time, there was a 95% probability of clear weather in the western part of the big island of Hawaii for the solar eclipse. But 2 things happened leading into the time of the eclipse. The first happened way away from Hawaii, over in the Philippines. The month before, in June of 1991, there was a tremendous volcanic eruption, Mount Pinatubo, which put a tremendous cloud of ash and dust into the atmosphere over the northern hemisphere. That meant that the beautiful blue skies that we want during the daytime would be kind of hazy. That wasn't all that bad, really. And during the sunrise and sunset period, thanks to that aerosol cloud of ash and dust, we had some beautiful sunrises and sunsets. Look at that red color enveloping the skies around the time of sunrise and sunset. That's something we couldn't stop. And then the other thing we couldn't stop was, remember I said 95% chance of good weather? Well, there's also a 5% chance the weather could be bad. And unfortunately, around the time of the eclipse, that's just what happened. That 5% probability reared its ugly head. We had what was called a TUT, a tropical upper tropospheric trough, rarely, if ever, in the month of July, but it was happening this July of 1991 and brought with it widespread cloud cover and even some spot showers. And on the morning of the eclipse was to start at 6:30 a.m. as seen from our ship. And a few hours before, like at 3:30, 4 a.m., we had not only cloud cover, but drizzle falling lightly on our ship. And it was about that time, with the eclipse happening just a few hours away, that, all these years later, people say, well, Joe, drizzling, cloudy on the ship, and all those people on the ship relying on you to bring good weather. Were you frightened? And I tell people, frightened? You're listening to a man who has laughed in the face of death, sneered at doom, chuckled at catastrophe. I was petrified. I really didn't know what to do, where to go. This TUT covered seemingly the entire region around the Hawaiian Islands, and I honestly, even with computer and satellite information, really didn't have any clue until I called Hans Rosenthal at the Weather Service in Honolulu, and he said, we're looking right now at the very latest satellite images that show a hole, an opening developing in the clouds to the south and west of where you're located by about 40 miles. He said, if I were you, I would get that ship to move in that direction toward that hole. It looks like they may open up enough so that you'll have a view of the sun. This could be your salvation. And I told the captain of the ship, Captain Haw, what I just learned from the Weather Service. He barked a few commands. The ship immediately turned 90 degrees toward the southwest, and we went at full bore, 27 knots, to that region that they told us at the Weather Service showed an opening in the clouds. And sure enough, when we arrived there just around sunrise, it was indeed clear. And you can see me and also the back of my sister's head. She was with us too. And way off in the distance, another ship. Well, that was the sister ship. We were on the SS Independence of Hawaii Cruises, which sold out so quickly that Hawaii Cruises said, well, we're going to need another ship. And they enlisted the sister ship, the SS Constitution, which filled with Eclipse Chasers as well. And so we radioed the SS Constitution, said, hey, we're headed for this particular part of the Pacific Ocean where we know the weather is going to be clearing. And they headed there, and there they were. And they docked about a mile away from where we were. And together, we waited for the total phase of the eclipse. You see people on board the ship, our ship, looking skyward at the eclipsing sun. And at totality, there it is. A bit hazy and a few high clouds, but there was the sun, there is the corona, and unfortunately down below in the direction of and over the big island of Hawaii, sadly, was the area of cloud cover which obscured the sun for the thousands and thousands of people who were told or thought that they were going to get a guaranteed view of the sun and the eclipse because of the 95% probability of clear skies, which only goes to show you that climate is what you expect, but in the end, weather is what you get. Probably the most spectacular feature of this eclipse was something called the seahorse prominence, a tremendous cloud of hydrogen gas lifting off the surface of the eclipsed sun and giving the impression on this photograph of looking very much like a seahorse, if you will. We also had celebrities on this particular cruise. The gentleman you see on the left in this photograph was Frederick Pohl, who was a very well-known science fiction writer, perhaps with the singular exception of Isaac Asimov, probably one of the greatest science fiction writers of the time. Next to Frederick Pohl was George Keen. He made his mark in the eclipse of 1979, the one that I saw from Montana. He was in Montana and took a beautiful photograph of the total eclipse, which made the cover of the April 1979 edition of Life magazine. George was there to instruct all of us on board the ship on how to take great pictures of the solar eclipse. But the one celebrity on board which I really admired more than Fred and George was this man off to my left, and this picture on the right to me, and that was Michael Collins, a name which may be familiar to you. He was astronaut Michael Collins, command and module pilot on board Apollo 11, the first flight to send men to the moon. And I got to know Mike Collins very well. One morning, I even had a chance to sit down with him for breakfast. Many refer to him as the forgotten astronaut because he was left by himself circling the moon in the command module while his colleagues, Armstrong and Aldrin, cavorted on the lunar surface. But to me, I was impressed by how gentle he was. No envy, no jealousy, no great desire to be any greater than he was. And to me, certainly one of the greatest individuals that I ever had a chance to meet. In 1998, another cruise ship, another chance to see another total eclipse. This one crossing through the Pacific into the Atlantic, touching Central America, the Panama area, Panama Canal, northernmost sections of South America, and our ship, appropriately renamed the Galaxy, would be located off of this island that you see here. That is the island of Montserrat in the Caribbean, where we would get almost 4 minutes of total eclipse. But before this cruise, and once again I would be the meteorologist for that particular cruise ship, that's a great job to have, isn't it? To have a cruise in the Caribbean in the cold month of February. Nice work if you can get it. But before that occurred, in November of the previous year, 1997, I had a chance to write for Reader's Digest. And the article that I wrote was all about my interaction with my grandfather and how he showed me my very first total eclipse. And it was kind of like a family values article talking about how I learned about astronomy and science and space, chiefly because of my grandfather showing me that eclipse that July afternoon in 1963. Now, when you write for Reader's Digest, a magazine that is distributed to 28 million people around the globe, a magazine that is printed in 19 different languages, you're ought to get some commentary from people who read whatever it is that you published in the magazine. And I received many, many complimentary letters and emails from people who read my article. But the one thing that stood out among anything else was what I received, a note from Mrs. or Ms. Barbara M. Vargo of Rapid City, South Dakota. She wrote a note to me saying, "I was deeply touched by your story in Reader's Digest, for I too saw the 1925 eclipse like your grandfather from the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and I am enclosing something that I have been carrying around with me for quite some time. I've decided to pass it on to you, as I think you might make a better home for it." And what it was a filter, a solar eclipse filter dating back to January of 1925. It cost all of 10 cents back then. And that filter could be used to look at the 1925 eclipse. And as a tribute to my grandfather, on board the Galaxy for the 1998 eclipse, I discarded my welder's glass and other materials that I normally would use to look at the eclipse, and instead used that filter to look at look at the partial phases of the eclipse. You don't use a filter to look at totality, but I used that again as a tribute to my grandfather. And during totality, well, we had a view of a beautifully totally eclipsed sun, and above and to the left of the sun at totality, we literally popped into view the planet Mercury, and below the sun also popping into view as darkness fell over the ship and over the ocean, at total eclipse the planet Jupiter. So here you had Jupiter, Mercury, and a beautiful corona with long streamers going to up to the north and to the south. It was very, very, very nice. In 2008, Glenn, you remember Glenn, my good friend from the Hall of Science and from Columbia and Montana. Well, Glenn managed to coerce a company called Air Events Polarflug. They are based in Dusseldorf, Germany. And what they do is they travel several times during the summertime from Dusseldorf. They fly a plane all the way up to the North Pole. They don't land, but they fly over the pole. You fly around the pole several times and get a chance to tell everybody that you flew over the North Pole, and then you fly back to Dusseldorf. And Glenn contacted this company and said, do you know that there's going to be a total eclipse of the sun not far from the North Pole on August the 1st? Maybe you might be interested in flying one of your North Pole flights up toward the pole, and along the way, we'll get a chance to see a total eclipse. By this time, in 2008, Glenn had become very prolific in being able to write up flight plans for airborne expeditions to see total eclipses. He'd write up the flight plan, the pilot obviously would follow it, and maneuver the plane into the shadow of the moon to see a total eclipse. Well, he did that for Polarflug, and the people there who were in charge said, this is great, we'll do it. We're gonna see a total eclipse of the sun. And here you see Glenn on board the flight. This was an Air Berlin flight, and he was allowed in the cockpit to set up his camera and equipment just before the flight. But about 10 days before the eclipse, the people at Polarflug came to Glenn and said, you know, we're going to get a lot of publicity here in Europe. We would love to have publicity in the United States. Do you know somebody in the news media in the United States who might be interested in covering this for us? And we will certainly allow him to come on the plane for free to write about it. Glenn got on the phone and said, what can you do? You have a lot of media connections. Can you somehow manage to publicize this event? If you can do it, you can come on board the flight. And that was a pretty darn good offer, because a window seat on this flight, either to see the North Pole through your window or to see the eclipse, would cost upwards of $10,000 and $12,000. And here I was being asked to do something for the airline, publicize this trip, and I'd be allowed to come on board for free. So, with my connections with the Hayden Planetarium, the Museum of Natural History, I contacted the magazine published by the museum, Natural History Magazine, founded 123 years ago in 1900. Its mission is to promote public understanding and research findings by staff members of the Museum of Natural History. I said to them, hey, I'm going to be flying up to the North Pole, and on the way I'm going to see a total eclipse of the sun. Would you be interested in publicizing that in the magazine? They said they'd love it. They'd love it. Sure. So I went back to Glenn. Glenn told the people at Polarflug, and before you know it, I got myself on board that flight. Here was my boarding pass, believe it or not. As you can see, flying from Dusseldorf to a fictitious point, which would be in the zone of totality. And here, by the way, was my window. Of course, the people who spent $10,000, they got a nice full viewing window. For me, I didn't get that. I didn't pay any money, but what I did was get a window. It would only be 3 inches wide, and it was on the escape hatch. And thankfully, this was not Alaska Airlines, where the hatch flew off recently. But this hatch, fairly secure. And you say to yourself, how can you possibly see much of anything through a window only 3 inches wide? And how can you even take a good picture? Well, yes, I did manage to take some good pictures. Here's the diamond ring as we had the total phase of the eclipse coming to an end. And down on the ground, you see the darkened cloudscape, darkened, of course, by the shadow of the moon. And after we landed back in Dusseldorf, very successful, here are all the people who were very, very happy at being part of this expedition, including yours truly giving the thumbs up. When I got home, I was able to write the article for Natural History Magazine, and somebody actually saw this particular article and said, this is a great article, and put it up for nomination to the American Astronomical Society for their Popular Science Award in the Science Writer Journalist category. And guess what? It won. I won the in the Solar Physics Division of the AAS this particular article for Natural History magazine, and it was wonderful. And I owe it to Glenn, because if it weren't for Glenn getting me involved with this whole thing, I never would have had the chance to see the eclipse and write about it for Natural History, and in turn end up winning this very, very special award. In 2016, there was an eclipse that was going to occur over Indonesia. That's where everybody was headed, for Indonesia. But when I looked at the eclipse map, what I saw was a path of eclipse, that totality, which ran from in between Hawaii and Alaska. And I said, gee, I wonder if there's a flight from Alaska to Hawaii or vice versa, where we might be able to see and catch the eclipse, just like I did in 1990 with American Transair. Remember a few moments ago I mentioned Alaska Airlines? Well, guess what? Alaska Airlines, did have a flight which would fit the bill, that would allow us to see an eclipse from one of their regularly scheduled commercial flights, Flight 870, from Anchorage, Alaska to Honolulu, Hawaii. And I managed to put on my salesman's hat, gave a pitch, and Alaska said, it sounds great. That's a great idea. And this time we had to delay the flight by 25 minutes. But there you go, Alaska Airlines Flight 870, and they had promoted this heavily in the news media, that's what they were going to do, attempt to interact and intercept a total eclipse of the sun. Here's the flight plan, which was initially written by, again, my friend Glenn Schneider, which was passed along to Alaska Airlines. Here is Captain Hal Anderson. The night before, I and some other eclipse chasing buddies, we all got together. We were going to be on this flight, and we treated the captain and his crew to a dinner. And this is Captain Anderson explaining how he planned to maneuver the plane for the eclipse. Here's Captain Anderson again, as I'm giving him last minute information, last minute weather data. And here is the report that I ran, or was run on News 12. Remember, I told you that I was the meteorologist, the chief meteorologist at Channel 12 at Westchester in the Hudson Valley, and I did what we call a news package about this little adventure. And this is how it ran on News 12 in the aftermath of our seeing the eclipse from the flight.
Now to a News 12 special report. Not many people get the chance to see a solar eclipse from the air, but our chief meteorologist convinced a major airline to alter the path of one of its regularly scheduled flights to give passengers and crew a chance to experience an incredible celestial sight. Here's Joe Rao's remarkable story, Into the Eclipse.
Oh my God, look at it. Here comes a shadow. Look at that. It's like a tornado. Oh my God, here we go.
Exclamations of wonder from a person witnessing a sight that few people in their lifetime ever get a chance to see. This is the shadow of the moon streaking silently over the Pacific Ocean at 7,000 miles per hour, about to rendezvous with a commercial jet aircraft just prior to the start of the most awe-inspiring sight the heavens can offer, a total eclipse of the sun.
Totality! Totality!
But it was the circumstances of how this flight came about that garnered national attention.
We are about to embark on a trip that a lot of people are calling historic here. Now, a second ago, I spoke to the man who actually did this whole process. A year ago, Joe Rao noticed that this path of the eclipse was going to cross between Hawaii and Alaska, and he contacted Alaska Air to make this special flight happen.
And that's how, in the dead of winter, I found myself heading to Ted Stevens International Airport in beautiful Anchorage, Alaska, on a day where the Alaskan mountains sparkle and plane tickets promised Hawaii. Waiting for me at the gate was Captain Hal Anderson of Alaska Airlines, who was going to pilot our journey into darkness.
It's a rare privilege to see a total eclipse, particularly from 37,000 feet.
I think Alaska Airlines should be congratulated, because most other airlines just give you an in-flight movie. We're going to go one better than that, much better than that. We're going to give you a chance to see something you may never see again, a total solar eclipse.
That's the promise I made to all the passengers as we boarded a packed 737 jet en route to Honolulu, where the in-flight entertainment began with a pair of eclipse safety glasses. And soon, everyone on board began to get into place for the big show in the sky. The dark silhouette of the moon was about to begin crossing directly in front of the disk of the sun. First, just a small bite cutting into the bottom of the sun. And as the minutes ticked off, that bite became progressively larger, and larger, and larger still, cutting the sun down to a narrow crescent. In the final moments before totality, just like curtain time before a Broadway play, the light rapidly dimmed. Then, 700 miles north of Honolulu, the main event. Sun, moon, plane, perfectly aligning for a perfect moment.
Perfect timing. Perfect timing. Oh, yes. Once in a lifetime view.
Time just stopped. The eclipse was frozen above us, like a phenomenal photograph pasted on the dome of the sky. The incredible corona, the crown of the sun, was now in full view. Study of this solar atmosphere is one of the main scientific benefits from an eclipse. More is being learned about the corona all the time. Some believe it may have an effect on the Earth's weather. But time was not standing still. After just 113 seconds, the moon's movement brought forth a second sunrise, ending the late afternoon darkness that had stretched across the horizon. And the passengers were still in awe.
Look at this sun. You could see that thing coming at you, both sides of it, like a blanket being thrown toward your face.
I have never seen one before, and it was spectacular, especially when the moon was totally over the sun.
Spectacular and eerie at the same time. Most on board soon came to realize that for them, such an amazing sight may never come again, proving that age-old saying is true. Why worry about your destination when the journey looks like this? Joe Rao, News 12, airborne above the North Pacific.
An amazing adventure, and it didn't end. Here's a view of all of my friends, and with, again, Craig's Eclipse flag in the aftermath, another successful eclipse flight. And I said it didn't end. The next year, with the 2017 eclipse that went across the United States from the West Coast to the East Coast, Alaska Airlines asked again Glenn and myself to perhaps join in and provide them with information on how they could fly, this time a charter jet with the news media for this eclipse. And we did that. We positioned the plane this time around 1,000 miles off of the Oregon coastline. You see how the plane headed southwest, then began to turn up to the northwest and then north into the shadow of the moon. Glenn decided he was going to stay on the ground for this one and see it with his daughter Maya. You see Maya there just beyond Glenn in Oregon. But I was in Oregon with the news media, and this is the complete gaggle of photographers and reporters getting ready to go on the plane. I'm giving them last minute information about it before we all got on board to see that event. Here I am sitting on the plane next to my windows and my cameras, again, being interviewed. Here is Captain Anderson and Captain Holm. They're, making last minute changes. How do they fly a plane with all of this stuff? It's incredible. I give pilots, airline pilots, all the credit in the world for being able to know how to fly the darn thing with all of this in front of them. And here am I looking at the totally eclipsed sun in 2017, August 21st, with my binoculars through the window seat of my position on board the plane. Best part of all, I was able to share it with my family. Renata, here's me, here's my daughter Maria, who is a speech pathologist, and my son Joseph. He's a chip off the old, with a slice off the old ham. He teaches physics for high school students in Orange County. So the four of us got a chance to be together on this amazing event. I want to thank my grandfather, who passed in 1993, but got me started in science and got me interested and hooked in eclipse chasing. My mom, who passed away last year at the age of 90, she was frequently taking me on visits to the Hayden Planetarium. She was my #1 cheerleader, and during Christmas and birthday, she was always getting me books on science and astronomy, and helped me out, and always encouraged me to study science at a very young age. But I leave the last bit of this presentation to Glenn, who is an eclipse chaser of the first magnitude. I've only seen 13. He's traveled to 35 eclipses since the early 1970s. And it was Glenn who said that if you want to experience the ultimate in human emotion, curiosity, imagination, then by all means, see a total eclipse of the sun. Even if you are starving, in hock, in trouble with the law, unbalanced, and totally addicted, see it anyway. It's worth it. And to all of you listening, I thank you for listening to me talk for the last hour and 10 minutes. And I again urge you, if you have that opportunity on that second Monday in April, instead of staying here in the New York area, please, please do yourself a favor and get into the zone of the total eclipse. It will be total in such places as Buffalo, Niagara Falls, Syracuse, Rochester, Plattsburgh, New York, Watertown, New York, all upstate. In this area that we live in, get on Interstate 87, travel north, maybe 4 hours will get you into the zone of totality. When you consider that there are people, astronomers, who will travel halfway around the world to see this site, and here all of you, one is coming, literally knocking at your back door. Don't pass up on this. If you have a chance, please get a chance and see this, because if you do, I guarantee you, it'll be something that you will never, ever forget, and you'll remember for as long as you live. That's pretty much it. Does anybody have any questions?
Thanks so much, Joe. I have a question. So in our area, Westchester, we will have a partial eclipse.
Yes.
Is that true? Okay.
Yes, you will see at 3:25 that afternoon, weather conditions permitting, 91% of the sun will be covered by the moon. And you say to yourself, wow, that means it's going to get 91% black? No, it doesn't. What it means is that even if the sun is out and brightly shining, it'll seem as if it's kind of a cloudy, hazy day. The light level will diminish to about that much. But for the total eclipse, within a matter of 30 seconds, the light will go from 20 minutes before sunset to 40 minutes after sunset. It'll be like somebody turning down a great dimmer switch, and the sky will darken. And during that time, the brilliant corona will pop out into view around the sun. Always there, but you can only see it when all of the sun is covered. You can discard your special safety glasses and all other paraphernalia that you were using to look at the partial eclipse. During the partial phases, you need to protect your eyes. But during a total eclipse, you don't need to worry about damaging your eyes. The sun is totally behind the moon. You'll be able to look directly at it. And also during totality, stars and planets will come out. The horizon will glow with a weird coloration, saffron, or the color of an iodine or a beer bottle, or oranges and yellows. It's just an absolutely amazing sight. And as you may have heard Keith, when I showed you that 1979 eclipse, he said just near the end of the eclipse is, oh my God, I got to see another one. This is unreal. It is. You have to see it for yourself. If you've ever seen one before, you know what I'm talking about. If you never have, please don't pass up on this opportunity, because the next time we'll have an eclipse coming, a total eclipse coming as close to the New York area as we have for this one, won't be until May 1st, 2079. So I don't think any of you are going to be around in 2079. I certainly won't. So if you want to get your chance, here it comes in a little less than a month from now, a total eclipse of the sun.
Wow. And when you had mentioned before about cloud coverage that can obscure the view, is there anything to if you're in an area that has higher pollution, is there a worse view in high pollution cities?
No, it has nothing to do really with pollution. It's the cloud cover. You don't want clouds to be in the sky. And if you do get stuck with clouds, and if you're in the zone of total eclipse, what's going to happen is that you won't see the sun, but generally the clouds themselves take on a weird looking color. In 1972, as I said, I was in Canada and almost missed it because of the clouds. But the one thing I do remember is that the clouds went from a battleship gray to a weird orange and yellow coloration just as totality set in. And then just before totality ended, again, the clouds turned that reddish or orangey color. It's a weird sight. So that's the important thing, is to try to get to a spot that's free of any cloud cover. I suspect that if people who are in the totality zone learn the night before that there's going to be a cloud cover, that they'll jump in their car and travel maybe hundreds of miles to get to a spot where it's clear. Lauren Mirzio just asked me on the chat board, what is the closest place relative to Westchester to see a total eclipse? The closest place is, as I said, get on Interstate 87 and travel straight north for about 4 hours. The first community that will be in the totality zone will be a place called Shroon Lake in the southern Adirondacks. That's north of Saranac Lake, actually. But if you travel into the Adirondack zone, you'll be able to get into totality. You'll also be able to see it from Syracuse. Somebody else writing here, do you think it's driving the same day, April the 8th? I don't know where Brant Lake is, Julie Mahoney, so I don't know if it's in totality, but you can go on any website, and just type in on Google April 8th, 2024, and you will get, well, if it's one exit before Shroon, you're probably going to see 99.9%. So look, if you're one exit before Shroon, how much further do you have to go to get to Shroon Lake in terms of time? You're literally right there to see totality. So all I could say is just go on Google, type in April 8, 2024, or type in Great American Eclipse. You'll find dozens of different websites giving you all kinds of information and maps and charts as to where the total phase of the eclipse will be visible from. And you can make reference to that and take a look and see where you might want to end up to see the eclipse. If not in New York State, there are 14 other states that are in the zone of totality, and portions of Atlantic Canada and Ontario and Quebec. Montreal, the biggest city in Canada, is in the totality zone for this eclipse. Toronto, just barely outside the track, but Texas, Arkansas, portions of Missouri, cities like Cleveland and Indianapolis and Dallas and San Antonio. Again, just check out on social media the maps and area of totality visibility zones, and you'll be able to see for yourself where the eclipse is going to take place. I must, at this point in time, leave you because I have an internet show. It's called the Joe and Joe Weather Show that starts on YouTube at 8:30, and it's 8:30 right now.
All right. Thank you so much, Joe. And as I said, we're recording this and we will have it up on our YouTube page.
Thank you. Good luck, everybody, in a few weeks for the eclipse. Thank you.